In the autumn of 1879, in the high desert country of southeastern Nevada, a woman named Cora Finch paid $3 for a dead man's claim. She was 27 years old, and she had $11 left in the world. The claim certificate was printed on paper the color of old cream, and the ink had faded at the edges where the previous owner had folded it many times, as if consulting it in doubt or in hope, or in both. The auctioneer at Pioche held it up by one corner and announced that the claim had been worked and then abandoned, that the recorded improvements amounted to a single shaft 40 feet in depth, and that no ore of value had been extracted from it in its 8 years of recorded history. He said this with the flat satisfaction of a man closing a ledger. Then he named the opening bid, and no one in the assembled crowd moved. Cora moved. She raised 2 fingers from her coat pocket, the way her father had taught her when she was small enough to stand between his knees and watch him bid at rock sales in the mining country of central Nevada. $3, she said. Her voice was level. The auctioneer looked at her the way men at auctions looked at women who spoke out of turn, which was to say with the particular expression of a man who suspects a joke, but is not yet sure who is laughing. He waited a full 10 seconds for another bidder. No one spoke. He brought the gavel down. She walked out of the auction hall with the deeds tucked into her coat and a man's laughter following her through the door. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her worth looking at. What she carried with her that afternoon was not only the deed. Folded inside her leather satchel was a small water-stained journal that had come to her 3 weeks earlier, on the day a Pioche freighter delivered the effects of one Emmett Harrow to the rooming house on LaCour Street where she was staying. Harrow had been her father's partner on the Nevada side for 6 years, and he had died in July of a rattlesnake bite at a camp below the Bristol Range. And he had left behind 2 blankets, a tin plate, a bent spoon, and this journal. He had left no will and had named no heir in writing, being the kind of man who believed that setting down intentions invited interference from the world. The rooming house landlady had given her the effects in a flour sack, along with an unasked-for opinion that prospecting men generally left nothing worth having. Cora had thanked her, taken the sack, and sat down alone to read every page of the journal that night by lamplight. Her father, Gideon Finch, had died in the spring of that same year, of a fever that moved faster than anyone expected. He had died without assets, without property, and without the answer to a question he had carried for 8 years. That question was this: what had happened to the ore he and Emmett Harrow had recorded in their private notes, in a shaft they had sunk in the summer of 1871 on a claim outside Pioche, before the land records changed hands in a way that neither of them had consented to? Gideon Finch had been a prospector since before Cora could remember, and before he was a prospector, he had been a hard rock miner in the California diggings, working for other men until he had learned enough to work for himself. He was a quiet man with large hands and the permanent squint of someone who has spent decades measuring distances against the sun. He had moved to Nevada when the Comstock drew everyone, and he had stayed after the Comstock's first great flush, because he believed, with a patient certainty that was neither romantic nor stubborn, but simply methodical, that the ground in southeastern Nevada had not yet said everything it intended to say. He had been right. The trouble was that being right was not, in the Nevada of 1871, sufficient protection against a man with better connections to the recorder's office. Cora had grown up watching her father work rock. He had taught her to read a seam the way another man's daughter might learn to read scripture, slowly, with attention to what the text refused to say plainly. He was a methodical man, and what he had left her was his methodology. She could identify galena from quartz carbonate at 40 feet. She could read the angle of a fracture in limestone and tell you which direction the vein ran. She had spent her childhood in shafts and at the rim of shafts, handing tools down and lifting samples up, learning that the useful knowledge was always below, waiting for the right question. She knew the vocabulary of the ground the way she knew her own name, and she knew it more fluently than most men who had been working rock since before she was born. The journal was Emmett Harrow's, and it was not written as a narrative. It was written as a series of dated entries and measurements, the kind a man keeps when he is trying to remember something precisely and cannot trust his memory alone. Most entries were unremarkable, the daily record of a man working ground that offered small returns and intermittent hope. In late August of 1871, however, the entries changed. Harrow had written in a smaller hand than usual, as if he believed smaller letters were harder to read by lamplight over a shoulder. He described a second chamber, lateral off the main shaft, located behind a natural wall of limestone rubble that he and Gideon Finch had worked past by hand over a period of 4 days. He described what they found there in terms that were deliberately imprecise but unmistakable to anyone who knew the language. He named a quantity, which Cora converted in her head to a figure that made her set the journal down and sit very still for a moment, her hands flat on the table, and her breath slow and deliberate, the way her father had taught her to manage the moments when evidence exceeded expectation. He named a course of action, which was to seal the lateral entrance and file no report until they had secured their claim by means they were still working out. He described the sealing, he described the date, and then, in the entry for September of 1871, he wrote that the claim papers had been taken and refiled under a different man's name, that the recorder's office in Pioche had no record of the original filing, and that a man named Culver, who worked as an agent for a Pioche land company, had told Gideon Finch that his claim was invalid and his presence on the ground was trespass. Harrow's handwriting in this entry was uneven. He had been angry when he wrote it, and the anger had come through the pen in the way that anger does when a man has no other available instrument. The claim had been stolen. The journal named it plainly enough to anyone willing to read carefully. 8 years had passed. Both men who had worked that shaft were dead. The agent named Culver had risen to a position of moderate prominence in Pioche's land record business, and the claim itself had passed through several paper hands without ever being worked again, because whoever held the paper knew, or suspected, that the lateral chamber required explanation that no one wanted to provide. That was what Cora understood, reading by lamplight in September of 1879. The claim had not been abandoned because it was worthless. It had been left alone because working it would have required accounting for what was inside it, and no one who held the paper had a satisfactory accounting. She paid $3 for it the next morning. The town of Pioche in 1879 was not a young town by Nevada standards. It had been founded on silver, had burned and been rebuilt, had produced fortunes and swallowed men whole, and carried its history the way old mining towns always do, in the faces of the people who had stayed when the others moved on. The streets were still active, the stamp mills still ran at certain hours, but the frantic quality of early boom years had settled into something more like habit. The men who had made quick money were mostly gone. The men who remained were the ones who understood that the work was long and that the ground gave up its secrets on its own schedule, not on a man's. Cora had come to Pioche for the auction, and she had come alone, and the only person in Pioche who knew her purpose was a man named Reuben Voss, who had been her father's assayer for 12 years, and who ran a small assay office on Lacquer Street 2 doors from the rooming house where she was staying. Reuben Voss was a compact man of 62 with a gray beard, cut short and eyes the color of dry clay. He moved carefully as men who work with precise instruments tend to move, without waste or hurry. He had assayed every sample Gideon Finch ever brought him, and he had assayed them honestly, which in Pioche in 1871 was not something every assayer could claim. He had also, Cora now knew, been present on the day the claim records were disputed. He had been a witness to nothing that mattered legally, but he had been in the recorder's office when Gideon Finch came in to check his filing and found it altered, and he had seen the expression on Gideon Finch's face in that moment, which was the expression of a man who has been robbed by paperwork rather than by a weapon and knows that no one will take it seriously. Voss had carried that observation for 8 years without a use for it. He told Cora this when she came to him in September with Harrow's journal, setting it on his workbench and watching him read. Voss had read slowly. When he finished, he set the journal down and looked at the wall for a long time before he spoke, and Cora let him. She had learned early that a man who works with measurements does not rush his assessments. "Your father knew," he said. "He knew and could not prove it," Cora said. "Can you?" She had told him what she intended. He had looked at her with the expression of a man who is measuring something and not quite satisfied with the measurement, considering the tolerances. Then he had nodded once and told her where the claim sat in relation to the Bristol Range and what the ground looked like around the shaft collar from the last time he had been out that way, and what she would need to bring to get back inside a shaft sealed for 8 years. She had listened, and she had bought the deed, and on the morning after the auction she rode out of Pioche on a hired horse with her tools in a pack behind the saddle, and Harrow's journal buttoned into her coat. If you have ever watched someone work a shaft that has been sealed for 8 years, you know that it is not dramatic. It is not fast. It is patient, and it is unglamorous, and it is the kind of labor that separates the people who want a thing from the people who are willing to do what is required to get it. The shaft collar was overgrown with greasewood and had partially caved on the southern side. Cora spent the better part of the first morning clearing the collar by hand, hauling loose rock and brush back from the edge, working in methodical rings the way her father had taught her, so that she always knew what was below her feet and what was not. The hired horse stood tied to a creosote bush 40 feet back and watched her with the mild disinterest of an animal that has seen worse. The October sun was already low and warm rather than punishing, and the desert was quiet except for the sound of rock striking rock and the steady rhythm of her breath. She pulled a root ball from the south side of the collar and found the old timber cribbing underneath, cracked but intact. That was a good sign. Good. The shaft had been timbered at the collar, which meant whoever sank it had intended it to last. The shaft itself, once the collar was clear, was in reasonable condition. 40 feet of vertical drop, timbered at the upper 15 feet with planks that had dried and cracked but had not buckled. She rigged her rope around a deadman anchor she set in the ground 8 feet back from the rim, testing it 3 times before she trusted it, and descended hand over hand, taking her time on each timber, pressing her weight against each one before committing to it. At the bottom, she lit a candle and held it up, and spent a full minute simply looking. The floor of the shaft was dry. The rock walls were limestone, pale gray in the candlelight, with iron staining in the fractures that ran northeast to southwest. The air was still and cool, and smelled of old mineral and dry earth, the smell she had known all her life from shafts like this one, the particular smell of ground that has not been breathed by another person in some time. She stood still and let her eyes adjust, letting the candlelight move as the flame steadied. Then she oriented herself to Harrow's journal entry, which she had read until she could recite it from memory, and began to walk the perimeter of the shaft bottom. The lateral entrance Harrow had described was behind rubble on the western wall. Someone had not merely sealed it with the natural material they moved aside during excavation. Someone had stacked that rubble with deliberate care, fitting the larger pieces against the face and wedging the gaps with smaller stone, working the way a man works when he wants something to look like it was never disturbed. It was the work of 2 hours at least, and it was the work of 2 men who knew what they were doing. Cora recognized it for what it was the moment her candle reached the western face. The color of the rubble was slightly different from the surrounding limestone, a fraction more gray, more worked, less weathered at its edges. The fit was too regular for a natural collapse. She had brought a short-handled pick, a pry bar, and a 2-pound hammer. She set her candle in a notch she cut into the wall with the pick's point and began. Harrow had written that the lateral chamber was behind 40 inches of packed rubble. She worked that afternoon and into the evening, resting when her arms required it, transferring the rubble behind her in a careful pile to keep the shaft floor passable ahead. She measured her progress in candle lengths, marking each half-inch of advance on the limestone with a scratch of the pry bar. By the time the third candle burned to its base, she had moved perhaps 24 inches of material. The work was slower than she had calculated. The rubble was denser toward the center of the seal, and there was one large piece, a single slab of limestone nearly as wide as the shaft passage, that required more than an hour of patient work with the pry bar before she could angle it free. She re-rigged her rope, climbed out at last light, ate cold biscuit and dried meat beside her hobbled horse, and slept on the ground with her coat over her shoulders and the satchel under her head. If you have ever kept vigil alone in desert country at night, you know how large the silence gets. Cora had kept vigil in worse places. She lay on her back and looked at the stars, which were very many and very clear at that elevation. She thought about her father, and she thought about the entry in Harrow's journal for August of 1871, and she thought about what it had cost 2 men to walk away from that shaft and leave what they had found inside it, knowing they had no recourse that the courts of 1871 Nevada were likely to honor. She went back down at first light. The second morning, her arms were stiff from the previous day's work, and she moved more slowly in the early hours. By mid-morning, the stiffness had worked out of her shoulders, and she found a rhythm. She discovered that the rubble wall was not uniform in its composition. There were 2 distinct packing layers, the outer one of mixed sizes placed for visual effect, the inner one of selected flat pieces laid on edge, the way you set stone when you want it to stand without mortar. The inner layer took more time than the outer. Each flat piece had to be twisted free rather than simply pulled, and she had to work around them so that they fell toward her rather than away from her, into whatever space lay beyond. The air changed before she saw the opening. She felt it first as a faint coolness moving past her left hand, then as a slight deflection in the candle flame, forward and to the right, as if something on the other side were drawing air toward itself. She set down the pry bar and pressed her palm against the face of the rubble wall. The stone was colder than the surrounding shaft air by a degree she could feel distinctly. Behind the fitted stone was nothing, or rather, behind it was a sealed space where 8 years of desert summer above had not fully reached. She worked the fitted stones out one by one. They were heavy, each one requiring 2 hands and a careful quarter turn to free it without dropping it onto her feet, and she set each one on the shaft floor behind her with deliberate quiet, though there was no one to disturb. When the last stone came free, the candle flame bent forward into the opening, and she caught it with her cupped hand and held it steady. She held the candle through the gap first and looked before she went in. What she saw by the light of one candle was not large. The lateral chamber was perhaps 12 feet deep and 6 feet across, with a ceiling low enough that she would need to move through it bent at the waist. The floor was swept-looking, the limestone ground clean of loose material, which meant that the two men who sealed this space had taken some care with it. Harrow had described it accurately in his journal, even down to the cast of the ceiling, which sloped from right to left at a gentle angle. Along the right wall, which was natural limestone, a series of shallow pockets had been worked into the face at roughly chest height. In each pocket, set back from the chamber air, and wrapped in canvas that had dried and stiffened to the consistency of old leather over 8 years of sealed dark, were the samples her father and Emmett Harrow had taken from the seam before they sealed the chamber and filed their claim. She pulled on her work gloves and lifted the first canvas packet with both hands. It was heavier than she expected, and when she unwrapped it on the shaft floor in the cone of candlelight, the ore inside caught the light in a way that limestone does not. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time without speaking, because there was no one to speak to, and because the ore spoke clearly enough on its own. There were 11 packets in total. She counted them twice, touching each one. She did not unwrap them all. She didn't need to. What was in the first 3 was sufficient to confirm what Harrow's journal had recorded and what her father had known and had not been able to prove. She rewrapped the first packet with care, set it against the shaft wall, and sat down in the low lateral chamber with Harrow's journal open in her lap to the entry for August of 1871. He had recorded a figure. The figure was in his private notation, a system of columns her father had described to her once, half amused, saying that Harrow trusted no one's arithmetic but his own, and had developed a shorthand that nobody else could read without help. She had worked out the notation over 3 evenings in her room on LaCour Street, translating each column into standard figures by working backward from the entries she could verify independently. What it recorded was a quantity of silver ore, blocked out and sampled, sufficient at the prices of 1871 to retire 2 men and their families from mining work entirely. Silver prices had moved since 1871. She did not know by exactly how much. She knew the direction. She climbed out of the shaft in early afternoon, strapping the first canvas packet across her shoulders, and rode back to Pioche through the cooling desert air, with the kind of quiet that a person carries when they have found the thing they came looking for, and not yet had time to reckon with it. Reuben Voss assayed the ore that evening, working by lantern light in his back room, while Cora sat on a stool by the door with her hands in her lap and didn't speak. He worked as he always had, precisely and without commentary, until he was finished, pulling each sample in turn through his standard process with the focused attention of a man who has been doing this for 30 years and still finds each result interesting. When he was finished, he wrote a figure on a slip of paper, considered it, and handed it to her. She looked at the number. She handed the paper back to him. "Per ton," he said, "and there are 11 packets." She nodded. "Do you know what you have?" he said. It was not a question. "I know what my father had," she said. "I know who took it from him. What I need now is a recorder who will look at what I bring him without being on the inside of Culver's land arrangements." Voss folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket, as if he planned to keep the number for his own accounting. "The county recorder in Ely," he said. "He is not friendly to Pioche's land interests. He has been looking for a reason to intervene, I'm told, for some time. Has not yet had one that would stand up." Cora spent the next 4 days bringing the remaining packets up from the lateral chamber, working 1 or 2 at a time, traveling at dawn and returning before the town was fully awake. She stored them at Voss's office, in the back of a locked cabinet he had emptied for the purpose, wrapped in clean canvas she had bought from the dry goods store. On the 5th day, she packed her satchel, settled her bill at the rooming house, and rode to Ely. The county recorder's name was Alderman, and he was a careful man of 50 with a long chin and the methodical habits of someone who has built a career on the precise management of documents. He read slowly, and he read from beginning to end without skipping, which Cora regarded as the single most reliable indicator of a man worth trusting with paper. She gave him Harrow's journal, her father's original claim notes, which she had kept in the bottom of her satchel for 7 months since Gideon Finch's death, and the assay results from Voss, which she had copied in triplicate on 3 separate sheets, so that no single point of the argument depended on a document she could not reproduce. She explained the chain of events as plainly as she could, in the order in which they had occurred, without editorializing. Her father had said more than once to let the thing speak for itself. If it needed her help to make its point, she had brought the wrong thing. She had thought about those words for 7 months. She believed she had brought the right thing. Alderman read for a long time. He turned back to certain pages and read them again. He held the original claim notes next to the journal entry for September of 1871 and compared the dates without saying anything. When he finished, he set the documents in a careful row on his desk, the way a man arranges things when he wants to see them all at once, and looked at them before he looked at her. The recorder in Pioche, he said, was acting in Culver's interest, she said. That would need to be demonstrated. The journal demonstrates it. The refiling date is in the journal, and the original filing date is in my father's notes. The gap is 4 days. The refiling happened in those 4 days, in a recorder's office that has a record of Culver's land transactions going back to 1868. The original claim is in my father's handwriting. The recorder's stamp on the substituted filing is in a different ink from the surrounding text, which means it was applied separately. Alderman picked up Harrow's journal again and turned to the August entries. He read them once more, with a slightly different kind of attention, the attention of a man who is now looking for something specific. Then he set the journal down. The claim is yours, he said at last. Under the original filing date, which predates Culver's instrument by 4 days, the claim is yours by Nevada statute. The question of the recorder in Pioche is a separate matter and a larger one than I can resolve in this office today. He paused. That investigation will take time. I am not in a hurry, Cora said. She was not. She had waited 8 years beside her father as he tried and failed to find a way forward without the evidence that the sealed chamber held. She had waited 7 months after his death, keeping his notes in the bottom of her satchel and reading Harrow's journal until she could recite it aloud. She could wait as long as the recorder in Ely needed. What followed was measured and methodical, as these processes always are when the documentation is sound, and no one in a position of authority has a stake in keeping it unsound. A lawyer in Ely who specialized in land title disputes agreed to take the case on terms that Cora negotiated herself, paying a portion in cash and the remainder from future proceeds of the claim, a structure the lawyer accepted because the documentation was strong enough that future proceeds were a reasonable assumption. The counter-claim filing went to the recorder's office in October, supported by the original notes and the assay results and Harrow's journal in fair copy, each page witnessed by Voss and signed in his hand. The Pioche recorder, faced with the weight of the counterfiling and the attention of the county seat, proved to have less appetite for continued resistance than he had shown for the original manipulation. Men who commit fraud through paperwork tend to rely on the paperwork remaining unchallenged. When the challenge arrives in proper form with proper evidence, the ground shifts under them in ways they did not anticipate. The recorder in Pioche resigned his position in November of 1879, citing health. His resignation was accepted without ceremony. Culver himself was not present for any of it. He had retired to California 2 years earlier, which was, in retrospect, why the claim had sat unworked and undeveloped long enough to reach an auction where a woman with $3 could buy it. His California address was not relevant to the claim transfer, and no one in Ely chose to make it so. His company's agent in Pioche, when presented with the counterfiling, reviewed the documentation and chose not to contest it. This was the right decision, and a purely practical one. There was nothing in the counterfiling that was not supported by documentary evidence and sworn testimony. There was nothing in the land company's position that could survive the kind of examination Alderman was prepared to give it. The claim passed back into Cora's name in December of 1879, on a morning so cold, the ink in Alderman's pen thickened and had to be held near the office stove before it would flow. She signed her name to 3 copies of the transfer instrument, collected one for her records, folded it, and put it in her leather satchel beside Harrow's journal and her father's original notes. The 3 documents together weighed almost nothing. They had cost her $3 and 8 years, and the life of a methodical man who had not lived to see the ground give the answer back. She did not mark the occasion with anything that could be observed from the outside. She thanked Alderman for his time, shook his hand, walked out into the December cold, and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, with her breath making slow white shapes in the air. Then she walked to where her horse was tied and rode. The shaft work began in earnest in April of 1880. She had arranged terms with a small partnership of miners out of Ely, 5 men who knew lateral chamber work and had done it honestly in 2 previous engagements, and who had agreed to wages and a modest share of proceeds that she had written out herself in a single clear document and had shown to the lawyer before she presented it to them. She had looked at every number twice before signing anything. Her father had looked at numbers twice. It was a habit she had no intention of breaking. She was present at the shaft every day of the extraction. She descended into the lateral chamber each morning before the men began, walked the seam, and came back up to stand at the collar and watch the first load come up. She was the last one out each evening. The men accepted this without comment after the first 2 days, which suggested they had worked before, for owners who knew what they were doing and understood that presence was a form of respect for the work. The extraction proceeded through April and into May and June. The ore from the lateral chamber was substantial and consistent, which is rarer than mining accounts tend to suggest. Silver ore tends to run in chutes that swell and pinch and deceive, and the most experienced miner cannot always predict what the next 6 inches will hold. The chute that Harrow and Gideon Finch had found in 1871 was not the miraculous overnight fortune that Nevada newspapers occasionally described. It was the kind of find that rewards sustained, methodical work over a period of weeks, which is the kind that actually gets taken out of the ground rather than disappearing into optimistic speculation. By the end of June, the extraction was complete. The accounts were settled, the partnership shares distributed, the lawyer paid in full. Cora had sufficient funds remaining to operate without immediate pressure for a long time, and a clear sense of what to do with the time that gave her. She was not interested in acquiring more claims. She was interested in the kind of work that her father's discipline had prepared her for, and that she had been putting off because there had always been something more urgent. She paid Reuben Voss in cash, more than he had asked. He accepted it without protest and without sentiment, which was how she knew he had accepted it in the spirit she intended. They did not have a long conversation about it. They both understood what the money represented, and neither of them needed to say so. At the end of that summer, she rode back to Pioche, which she had not visited since December. She had no business there that she could not have attended to by letter. She rode back because her father had spent 6 years of his life working that country, and because Emmett Harrow was buried outside the town in a small cemetery on the eastern slope, and she had not yet been to his grave. She found it without difficulty. It was a plain wooden marker with his name and the year cut into the wood by someone who had taken some care with the letters. She stood at the foot of it for a while in the late afternoon light, with the desert going golden around her and the Bristol Range visible to the south in the clear October air. She did not speak. She had not come to speak. She had come because the journal had been his last act of record-keeping, the final thing he had set down before the July sun and the bad luck at the camp below the Bristol Range, and it had done the work he always intended it to do. The journal recorded what he had found and what had been done to him in the small, cramped handwriting of a man who trusted documentation over declaration. In that, he and Gideon Finch had been alike, and in that they had both been right. The world of 1871 had not had a use for what they recorded. The world of 1879 had. She stood a while longer. Then she rode out, and she spent the following year studying for and passing the Nevada Territory's surveyor examination, which she sat in Ely in the spring of 1881. The examiner noted in his records that she had scored the highest of any candidate he had seen in 3 years, with particular distinction in the calculation of irregular boundary parcels. She did not mention this to anyone. It was a number. Numbers did not require announcement. She worked as a surveyor's assistant through the rest of 1881 under a survey firm in Elko County, and in 1882 she was granted her own certification and began filing surveys under her own name. The work suited her. It was methodical and precise, and it produced documents that mattered, that told the truth of where things were and where they were not, which was the kind of truth she had been taught to value since childhood. By the mid-1880s, she had built a sufficient reputation in Elko County to hire assistants of her own. She was particular about who she trained. She preferred candidates who understood that the work required more patience than cleverness, who could look at an irregular parcel and take the time the measurement actually required, rather than the time they wished it required. She trained 2 young women in Elko over the course of several years, both of them careful and observant in the way that the work demanded, both of them the daughters of working people who had not had the kind of opportunities that a surveyor's certification could provide. There is a survey record in the Elko County Archives filed in the spring of 1884 for a parcel along the Humboldt River. The surveyor of record is listed as C. Finch. The measurements are precise to within the tolerance the territory required, and in 2 places they are more precise than that. The kind of precision that adds time to a job and adds nothing to the fee, but that a methodical person does anyway, because the point of a measurement is that it is accurate. The leather satchel she had carried since Pioche wore out around 1886. She had it replaced by a saddler in Elko, the new one similar in cut and weight to the old. She asked the saddler to transfer the brass catch from the first satchel to the second, because the catch had been her father's, fitted to the satchel when he gave it to her the year before his death. The saddler charged her 20 cents for the transfer. She paid without negotiating. The deed to the original claim, the $3 instrument from the Pioche auction, she framed and hung in her office above her drafting table, not as a trophy and not for sentiment, but as a reference point. It was the beginning of a chain of evidence, and she liked being able to see exactly where the chain began. It reminded her that most things that matter are already somewhere in the ground, already existing, already true. They simply need someone to come down and get them. Harrow's journal she kept in the satchel until the end. She did not copy it or share it with anyone who did not already know the story. It was not a public document. It was a private record made by a man who had watched an injustice proceed and had done the only thing available to him, which was to write down what he had seen in language that someone else would eventually know how to use. She left it to Clara Holt, the younger of the two women she had trained in surveying, who was the daughter of a miner from the same Pioche district, and who had asked on an October afternoon in 1884, standing at the rim of a test bore, where Cora had learned to read a seam. Cora had thought about how to answer that question for a moment before she spoke. Then she said that she had learned it from her father, and that he had learned it from the ground itself, and that the ground had no interest in what you thought you knew before you started digging. Clara had written that down in her field notebook. Cora had noticed and had said nothing, because it was the kind of thing worth writing down. The greasewood bloomed over the shaft collar every spring for 30 years after Cora left it, yellow and persistent and unmindful of what lay below it, the way things grow when the ground beneath them is finally at rest. If this story gave you something to carry with it, leave a word below. There is another one waiting here.